In the meantime, we're going to just hang out and listen to a little bit of music before we get going. Right. Looks like we are live on all of our socials. So yeah, we'll be getting the class actually started in a moment here. For anybody that is joining in on the socials, you're obviously welcome to check out our website. Hello, Zelda. You can visit our website at distillarts.org/Conchas y Café zine to learn more about the program itself. We're also going to be covering today, just general tips for giving feedback on writing. So it's a good opportunity for anybody that is interested in, maybe analyzing poetry, giving and receiving feedback on their work. Today is going to be mostly focused on that. And yeah, before we get fully going with today's lesson, I just wanted to invite people who are joining on the live streams to potentially, join the class in full through Google Classroom. If you go to the website, like I said earlier, you can find all the information for joining us via Google Classroom. And that way you can get, exclusive perks of being in the actual class. All right. Is that you, Angie? Representing?
Tú sabes.
All right. I'll make you co-host as well, along with Abraham. So in the house, we got Angie, our program coordinator, and of course, Abraham Jaramillo, our master teaching artist, joining in. They're available to answer questions too for anybody that needs a little bit of assistance during the session today. We're going to do some breakout sessions partially through. So for those joining on the live stream, once we do the breakout sessions, the live stream will end, and you will be obviously able to review the recorded live stream later on our YouTube channel to get the majority of the actual lesson. But for, again, the purpose of actually participating in the class with the extra added perks of workshopping your writing with us, you are recommended to actually fully enroll using Google Classroom. Again, visit distillarts.org/Conchas y Café zine for all of that. And that includes everybody joining in either on the YouTube live stream, the Facebook live stream, Twitter/X, and Instagram Live. Y'all got the information in the chats there. Anybody else a fan of Black Sabbath like me?
It first started off like Indian music, then it ended up like a mixture of Indian country and what else? I don't know. Tin Pan Alley.
Yeah, I have a very eclectic musical taste. So yeah, it's good to see you, Miss Lois. Good to have you in the house.
It's good to see you guys.
Yeah, the harmonica is awesome. All right. So I think we've got a pretty good amount of people in the house joining us on Zoom. Also on the live stream, we've got at least one person. So I'm glad that we have some people joining in that way as well. So yeah, let's actually get this show going. So I'm going to begin the recording now for those of you joining in at the moment. All right. And actually turn off the music real quick. Right as The Cure is coming on. All right. So again, welcome everyone. For those of you joining in tonight, today is the first official lesson of Conchas y Café Fall 2023 session. And today we're going to be mostly covering tips and techniques for analyzing and critiquing poetry, which is a very important skill to have, especially if you're going to be joining us throughout the entire 15 weeks of Conchas y Café this semester. The purpose of today is really to give you all the ability, the tools that you might need to be able to provide each other with feedback. Again, Conchas y Café has come a long way since 9 years ago now, when we first started the program. And one of the things that we're doing this time around that is different for basically all of you who have been joining us since the beginning is that not only are we providing our lessons in creative writing, but we're also giving everyone who participates the opportunity to have their work reviewed within a small cohort of compañeros in the class. And, this is a bilingual workshop series, so you can write in whatever language you prefer. That doesn't necessarily change any part of your ability to interact with the class. What does really help, though, is the ability to just, have your work prepared a few days before the workshopping sessions. That way people can come to the sessions with notes already set to, be delivered to you on your writing. So that is one of the reasons why we're hosting this particular session. So that way you all feel comfortable and prepared to provide that added service, we'll call it, to your fellow classmates. Now, we do have a handout that we will be using for today to kind of inspire some conversation. And as always, we like to start off with our typical quote, which isn't exactly a quote today. It's more of a question. The question for you is, why poetry? ¿Por qué poesía? ¿Para qué sirve? What is its purpose? What does it do for you? What is the impetus, the inspiration for it? Why poetry?
Is that a question to us?
Yeah, that's a question for everyone, whether you're on the live stream or not.
Can I speak it out, or do I have to write it?
No. Go ahead, Miss Lois.
It's a way to express your inner feelings. Sometimes people can't say things directly, but if they're a joker or something, or just creative in poetry, it's easier for them to express themselves.
Yeah, definitely.
When I used to have my workshops, and people would come in skeptical, like poetry is long hair and things like the music, but then I had to explain to them, and then they had to take a second thought and agree that rap is poetry set to music. And that goes way back to the blues that I used to hear my grandparents sing. It was a rhyme.
Yeah, absolutely. Poetry and music really do go hand in hand. And as a big fan of hip hop growing up, I definitely can agree with your sentiment there that rap is a form of poetry in itself. So yeah. In the chat, we have Zelda who added, poetry helps our hearts speak when words won't do, when our mouths can't. Yeah, definitely. Poetry has something that it says that sometimes other forms of communication can't. And River also agrees, rap is very much poetry set to music. Yeah. Abraham?
Well, I came from writing like more regular essays or other type of writings that is more about rules.
Mhm.
and I'm always kind of an anarchist in that sense, that I don't take rules that way.
Mhm.
And poetry is the type of style of writing where you can let go of so many rules
Mhm.
and use that towards your advantage. Like you can play with it and see where it takes you without the constraints of many of the writing rules.
Yeah, definitely. Poetry does allow for more creativity and expression that has rules, but can obviously also break rules all at the same time. Whereas, your average prose probably can't. But to answer Angie's question about can we talk about how we feel about modern poetry? Of course. I mean, that is the same thing. Why poetry? Why modern poetry? Why poetry in the classical age? Why poetry at the turn of the century? Why poetry in general? What do you think, Angie, as a poet yourself?
Uh, no, I was honestly just being a hater because if you go to, I mean, you know how you guys go to Target and then you see a bunch of books and kind of peek at the poetry section, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't, I'm for me, poetry. I'll just talk about poetry on my end and my experience. It's just always been a different language to me, and it's always been more of a way to help cope with reality and emotions. So that's that. I've always found it more entertaining when the poetry is a little bit more challenging,
Uh-huh.
where we have to sit down and analyze it. And I've always been able to relate to people more. And that's how I actually can say it. I connect and relate to people more when I know I can talk about like a sonnet or something, and we can break down this poem and see different points of views. And that's how I know, okay, I can, outside of poetry, I can talk to this person about anything because they look deep within, versus if we can't have a conversation about a hard poem or a specific poem or something that's not, like, I think considered lazy poems in a way. um it's like, oh, okay, I don't know, it just, I guess it's just a form of, for me it's a form of language and communication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, with no disrespect, what she just said,
Mhm.
and I'm gonna try and quote what she says, coping with reality. And when she
Mhm.
said that, how do you say, put I don't know, a spark to my heart.
Hmm.
And right away, Shakespeare came to mind, and I can just see her saying something, adding on to that, coping with reality. Yeah, that was a beautiful statement. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's well, yeah, I think, Angie definitely speaks some truth. Like the poetry that you might find at Target, of all places, may not be representative of everyone's story, but it's still poetry, and we can be critical of it. It doesn't mean that if it doesn't speak to us, it's not good poetry. It just maybe doesn't tell the story that we want it to tell to us. But poetry is about everything and anything, and it is something that can, connect us. It can dig into us. It can, take root and grow, and it has a lot of, I think, potential for really bridging gaps between each individual person. Poetry has that ability to say something that is in the very end very human. It's about the human experience, just like any other art. So for us as writers and artists, it's really important, I think, to understand that there is no such thing as good or bad art, only effective art, right? And the more effective it is, the more universal, the more human it might come across. And that doesn't mean that it has to be done in English. It doesn't mean that it has to be done in Spanish. It just means that it has to speak to the emotion of humanity. At least that's kind of my opinion. Um, yeah, we have some other folks chiming in the chat here on Zoom. Yes, I get it. Many styles, and sometimes there are trends that might not be as quote good, but I think there is always good ones in any style. Yeah, but some styles are hard to like. And Eric wrote, poetry is to play as it is in the expression of persona. Yeah, definitely. I think that it does give you the opportunity to use a voice that maybe you don't always get to use. And at the end of the day, it's about taste and, and sadly, who has the loudest microphone. Yeah, that is partially true. You know, I think just by virtue of being at Target, as an example, you know, Target, a national retail chain, you know, you have a bigger audience because of that, right? A bigger microphone, a louder microphone, maybe. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not poetry that could speak to someone. So, you know, we got to definitely approach poetry with an open mind.
Yeah, one of the fellows that I like to hear. Have you ever heard T-Bone and his rapping?
T-Bone?
Uh-huh.
Maybe it depends on which T-Bone you're talking about.
The Hispanic one.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, he does rap. He's an older fellow now. I mean, he's not as old as I am, but yeah, he's a good rapper. He does Christian rap, but I mean, he's good.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if he all Christian rap, but he's good. Look him up.
Well, shout out to T-Bone. Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for all your thoughts, everyone. I appreciate that. And thank you, Abraham, for expressing that in the chat there. That is why DSTL Arts is important for anyone who needs their voices to be heard. Yeah, I mean, that is part of the reason why I started DSTL Arts, you know, and why Conchas y Café in particular is a program that we created, because, you know, not often do we have the opportunity to tell our stories in our own voice, and which is also partly why, you know, we have these live streams now, and why we're trying to really give everyone as many opportunities as possible to participate, because we want as many voices to be heard and to be represented, especially if you look like us, if you come from our communities. But, you know, one of my favorite things to sort of reference every time when I think about the question about why poetry, you know, why do I write poetry as a poet? I do think of this quote from William Carlos Williams, who is an American poet, writer, and physician. He was actually a doctor, a practicing doctor, who is closely associated with modernism and imagism. We'll probably talk a little bit more about the time period in which William Carlos Williams was writing, given that our current theme for Conchas y Café is out of place. He himself, as a doctor, really, he wanted to be a writer, you know, but like a lot of us, you know, have to pay the bills. So he practiced a different profession while at the same time writing poetry in his everyday travels around northeast United States. But one of the things that I remember when I was young coming across was this particular quote that comes from his poem Asphodel, that greeny flower and other love poems. And he is quoted as saying, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." Y como ven aquí, se los traducí en español para ustedes que son los hispanohablantes en casa. Es difícil recibir noticias a través de poemas. Aún hombres mueren miserablemente cada día por falta de lo que se encuentra allí. So, ¿cómo les parece? What does this quote mean for you, or this particular little mini poem, this phrase of a poem? What does it say to you? What do you think William Carlos Williams was trying to say in this particular? Yes, Angie?
From my point of view, I believe that Williams was saying that, you know, one thing we can find in poetry is, like, I guess, like feelings and empathy, sympathy, and kind of more of the raw emotions that the world tries to black out. And, you know, we get like if we kind of go into society and we see what's going on, it's kind of, everything's like surface level. But if we would really kind of look deep within, we usually would be able to find the answers to solving a lot of like the world's problems. Sometimes it's like overcoming greed, overcoming hatred, and I feel like most of the time that's like who I feel like that's always been like what poets are. They're like trying their best to kind of introduce like the world in a different type of light, where we don't have to, where we can somehow survive by seeing each other as a community instead of competition. Does that make sense? I don't remember who the poem, who, like, I saw this on social media somewhere. I know it was like one of those film things that I always follow. But it's something along the lines about, you know, if the world would just listen to the poets, then, you know, we would be at peace or something like that. I have to find it. It's in a book too, I think. I'll find it for you.
All right. It'd be kind of cool to, you know, see how that, like, you know, maybe relates to this in a future class for sure. And I think that, you know, you definitely hit the nail on the head in terms of what is possible through poetry, right? Being able to create connections between us. River in the chat wrote, "It says to me that poetry feeds our souls in ways that news cannot." And yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Abraham, and then Zelda.
Well, first, when you start talking about the story of this guy, reminds me of Roberto Bolono, something like that. He had like the similar way of thinking about being a poet and like trying to survive just by poetry and not doing other jobs until he got sick and he has to actually start writing novels and stuff like that to survive. But he ended up doing really good stuff. But regarding this specific quote, I think that's what we're just talking about, like the difference between different styles of writing. Not that one is less than the other, but in this case, news is informative. It's about getting information across. Poetry is about a concept of how do I say this information instead of just giving you what's happening today. We're not talking about it's raining and 35 degrees. No, we're talking about rain feels this way and you better not get away. Things like that, right? So it definitely is a different way of working with words.
Yeah. I like how you put that. You know, it's about the modalities of communication, right? There's different modes for communication, and that's important to understand. Each one has its own purpose. Yeah.
Can I speak?
Well, Zelda was next, and then
go ahead. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Zelda.
All right, just unmuted. Yeah, so I've thought very often about how people will say, oh, I don't know how to write poetry. Oh, poetry is for special people. Oh, I'm not smart enough to write poetry. And somehow, at least in the course of my life, poetry has been put on this pedestal of something for a very small group of people who know how to do it. It's mysterious. And when I compare that to the news is something that is valued because people want to be informed. People feel that if they listen to the news, they will know how to navigate their life. And I think people very often don't appreciate how poetry is a means of communication, how we can learn from it, how we can exchange ideas through it, just like the news. And so to me, this is saying, it's very hard. We kind of do not appreciate the real value of poetry as a form of communication. And yet people die miserably not knowing the power of poetry. I guess that's what I get out of this quote.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that idea that, you know, we assign a particular value to certain types of communication. And I think you're right. You know, news is obviously seen as something that is meant to inform, something that is meant to give maybe people a reason for making decisions. But, you know, there's nothing that says explicitly that poetry can't do the same for us, right? Poetry potentially could inform you, it could teach you, it could help you make a decision about another way of living, or maybe just even what you might want to eat for breakfast tomorrow. You know, like there's a possibility because poetry gives you that kind of flexibility. So yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts, Zelda. Miss Lois, you are next.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying at first, that the forms of poetry doesn't fit everybody. You know, everybody has their own taste. And I got to hurry up and think because I forget my thought when I try to hold on to them. And what she was just saying, that there are many possibilities that poetry can interact, relate to, and inform, you know, give off information depending on what you yourself is looking for. And because we ourselves, when I say we, I'm just saying people in general, they don't have the, how you say, the concept that there is a possibility that they can get information. It says it's a wise man that listens even to a fool. So why not read it and try to comprehend what it's trying to say? And then when it says, yet men die miserably every day for lack. And that's because we don't try, you know, we in a box and we don't dare step out of it. Like she was just saying, you know, we just block ourselves in, and what we're doing, we're cutting off our blessings of receiving, you know, the enhancement of what poetry can really do for one. I mean, I could go on. I mean, oh man, but let me stop.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, I think, in the ideas of William Carlos Williams here. And yeah, I think that your comment speaks to parts of that, you know. In the chat, we also have you know, the idea here that there can be a lot of gatekeeping in poetry. You know, there is definitely this, at least historically speaking, this idea that something can be poetic and something cannot be. And that is something that we have actually seen in class before. You know, many years ago, during one of our sessions at the East LA Library, we had an older gentleman who is an excellent poet. You know, he definitely gets his dues and his respects. But one day we were talking about a poem that included a curse word. And by virtue of including a curse word, it was considered not poetic anymore, you know, at least in his eyes, which is fine. That's fair. But that didn't necessarily mean that the message wasn't important and that the poetry wasn't poetry. And that led to a really, I think, fruitful discussion, to where by the end of the session, our friend, you know, kind of changed his mind about what poetry could be. You know, so gatekeeping is, I think, one way in which people can, you know, make us, especially poets of color, think that we're not worthy of having our voices recorded. But that's absolutely not true. I mean, that's why we're here today. You know, we're here to say, like, our poetry, however it manifests, is going to still provide something that you can't get somewhere else. And I think that that's really important for us to remember. In the chat, we also have, I feel it communicates the need to turn to poetry. And I think that Alicia also, you know, is kind of picking up on something else that the quote says, right? It has basically two parts to the quote. The first part being, it is difficult to get the news from poems, right? So we have this statement that claims something about the comparison of news and poetry. The second half, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. You know, here Williams is trying to remind us that there is something there that you can only get out of poetry, that you can't get out of something else. So I feel like Alicia is definitely touching on that. And then we also have, it may simply say how strong and powerful poems can be, right? They can save lives. And yes, Don David did live in an age of censorship. So yeah, you know, I definitely think that all of us are probably on the same page in terms of why poetry. You know, what is the beauty of poetry and why it's special to us. Now, because we're going to talk a little bit about the purpose of poetry and how to critique it, it's good for us to have kind of a basic foundation. So for those joining on the live stream, at least through Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, you have the benefit of seeing on your screen right now the handout. For those of you joining on the Instagram live feed, I definitely recommend that you go to the website, distlarts.org/Conchas y Café zine, and fully register for the class, so that way you can have access to the handouts plus all the other perks of being fully enrolled in the class. But again, vocabulary is really more for us to have a common language, right? It's a way for us to be able to say things that we can all kind of, just generally understand when we're analyzing poetry. Prose, prosa, in Spanish, it's the basic, probably most common way in which we communicate in written form, right? It is not specifically metrical, meaning that it doesn't have any kind of rhyming or rhythm to it that is obvious. It can, but it doesn't have to, right? This is just everyday spoken language or everyday written language. Eso es lo que se llama prosa. Es el simplemente acto de hablar o escribir como se hace al diario. Poesía, a cambio, es el arte de la composición rítmica, escrita o oral. Rhythm and very deliberate ways of creating that rhythm, that's what eventually leads to poetry, right? And it can be written or spoken. It doesn't always have to be written down. In the earliest days of human language, storytellers began to exist within tribes. And those storytellers used rhyme and rhythm as a way to remember stories about their ancestors. And that's how a lot of these legends that we now know came to exist, right? Things that passed on from generation to generation. They were often done because of poetry. So that is when we speak about poetry, what we're ultimately talking about. We're talking about ways in which people create rhythm and ultimately art through language. Now, the core things that we can try to understand in poetry when reading it is that, it all centers around the use of a noun, a verb, and in some cases, adverbs, right? El sustantivo es una persona, lugar, objeto, estado de ser o una cualidad. It's a person, place, thing, but also a state or a quality, right? Nouns, we can't forget that they also include states or qualities. And that's what's really important when it comes to poetry, because we want to be able to find the precise word that goes with a particular idea or topic or theme. And then that particular noun will require a verb, some sort of action or some sort of indication of the state of its being, right? Poetry that is engaging will often have active verbs that are telling us the action of something, the state of it, its relationship with another in that moment. So those are the things that we're often looking for when we're talking about poetry and when we're analyzing poetry. Adverbs are all about the modification of it, right? Adverbs modify verbs. It can be the word very and very nice, or much and much more. It can also be like a color. It can also be a, indication of size or an indication of time, quickly, magically, red, blue, auburn. These are all things that are used to describe the noun that it's trying to modify or the verb that it's trying to modify. Sorry. Don't say fast, say in a blink of an eye, add details. Right. It's about giving you that extra tool to be able to help people not just hear the music in the poetry, but to also see the imagery of poetry. The adjective is the modifier of nouns and pronouns. It definitely is going to be something that you'll use in, basically everyday language. And an adjective, at least in poetry, when it's used effectively, it will add that extra layer of meaning, that extra little something special to your language. Prepositions are also, important as far as the structure, right, of language. It's a modifier of basically anything and everything. It's helping to, as you see here, express a spatial, temporal, or other relationship. So prepositions are normally going to be about time travel, time, space, and just the ways in which things interact. So these are the core things that you'll want to be looking at when you're reading poetry. What are these things saying, and why did they specifically get chosen in a given situation? Poetry's pepper. That's what a preposition can be, along with the adjective and the adverb, especially the adverb. All right. So, I'm not going to go too deep into these basic vocabulary words here. But, again, these are some vocabulary words that you might want to just remember, kind of brush up on as we enter into the new semester of Conchas y Café workshops. Now, when it comes to techniques in poetry, right, there are definitely some advanced techniques that we like to cover throughout our series, beginning with things like juxtaposition, right? Juxtaposition is, as you can see here, the act or an instance of placing two or more things side by side, often to compare or contrast or to create an interesting effect. And that last one, to create an interesting effect, that's where poetry, I think, really starts to shine. La yuxtaposición es cuando se usa la tensión para crear algo más allá de lo típico. It's how, as Abraham put it, how magic spells might happen. It's the way that you might make them work. So, yuxtaposición en español. El acto o una instancia de poner conjuntamente dos o más cosas típicamente para comparar o contrastar o crear un efecto interesante. Luego sigue el salto de línea, el punto donde termina un renglón de poesía. The line break is going to be as simple as it sounds. It's exactly the point where a line ends on the page. That is something that you can manipulate, and that is something that will really help you as you start to look at poetry and try to analyze your own poetry. Why are you ending on that particular word? What if you ended a word or two before? And how does that create maybe some juxtaposition for you, right? There's also the idea of the cesura. The cesura, una pausa, especialmente una pausa sensorial, típicamente en el centro de un verso. So the caesura is a pause, but it's not just any pause. It's usually going to be something that you see in the middle of a verse of poetry. And by verse of poetry, we're talking about a line of poetry, maybe a stanza of poetry, or it can be like dead in the middle of a poem, right? It's a very deliberate use of pauses, absence, silence, however you want to characterize it. But that is a way in which you can add emphasis, right? That comes down to the performance part of poetry. Enjambment is one way in which you can also create pauses or actually create rhythm that forces people to continue on. Enjambment is specifically the running on of a thought from one line, couplet, or stanza to the next, without a syntactical break. In other words, it's talking without breaking your grammar, but visually breaking apart the structure of a poem, of a line of poetry. And when you visually break it apart, the visual side of the poem then starts to create juxtapositions. It starts to create pauses. It starts to create very effective forms of poetry. For those of you that know me well, you know that enjambment is one of my jams. So you will hear me if you're, in my cohorts talking a lot about that and how to use that to your advantage. Enjambment en español se llama encabalgamiento, que es la continuación de una idea desde una línea de poesía, dístico o estrofa a la siguiente sin romper la sintaxis. Es gramáticamente la continuación de una idea, pero visualmente la forma que toma su poesía, eso es lo que al último llega siendo encabalgamiento. Zelda, do we have a question?
Yes. Do you have any examples of this enjambment handy?
I do. We'll actually go into it in a quick second here. But yeah, thank you for asking. I do realize that it is obviously helpful to have that on screen as well. And to finish off the last one, something that is, I think, good for all of us to sort of consider as poets, as artists, is the concept of poetics. La poética no es igual a la poesía, aunque sí puede ser similar, la idea. So poetics is a treatise or collection of notes on aesthetics. It's often expressed as poetry or prose, meaning that it can be written in the form of a poem or it can be written in the form of an essay. Poetics is basically just for you to describe your reasons for writing or creating in the way that you do. En español, poética significa un tratado o colección de notas sobre la estética, expresado en poesía o en prosa. So again, that's really more like for you to write down what it is that makes your poetry yours, right? It's in some ways, how should I put it? It's in some ways like your mission statement. This is the reasons for your poetry to exist. And Abraham did provide an example of enjambment in action in the chat. April is the cruelest month. Breeding, lilacs out of the dead land, mixing, memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Now, in the chat, it might be a little bit difficult to really see how that is enjambment. But if you notice, even though the lines end with the words like breeding, mixing, stirring, those actually continue on to the next line. So if you were to read it as a regular standard sentence in prose, you might read it as April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. But if you notice the way that I was performing it the first time, there's a pause after the words breeding, mixing, stirring. So it would read as April is the cruelest month, breeding, lilacs out of the dead land, mixing, memory and desire, stirring, dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So the performance of it is different, but the syntax, the grammar remains the same, regardless of how it's written. Another way to think about it, yeah, thank you, TSL.
Yeah, I think I got it a lot better when you read it, because then I could see the continuation.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and for on the screen here, for those watching on the live stream, as well as those of you on Zoom here, we have the quote from earlier, the William Carlos Williams quote. And if you notice, right, the first rewriting of it that you see on the screen here, that's written in the standard sentence format, right? That is standard prose. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. And if you look at it and you read it in sentence form, in prose form, right, it has a different effect than reading it in the way that William Carlos Williams actually wrote it. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. And if you notice, again, the way in which the poem is structured visually, it forces you to go on to the next line. That is what enjambment does. It forces the reader to want to continue in order to get the full context of what is being said. But visually, if you step away from that and you see the rhythm, you're going to get a different sense of what is happening. There's a power to using enjambment in that way. And caesuras, which are pauses in the middle of a line, those also help with giving your reader a sense of tension and a sense of, oh, this is a unique spot where I'm meant to focus my attention. So those are ways in which we can approach poems when we're analyzing them, by looking at, the structure of it and how that structure is really helping to effectively tell the story that it wants us to follow. Yeah. It leaves the sentence incomplete and follows it onto the next line, as Abraham is saying in the chat there. So that's the purpose of enjambment, and really the purpose of juxtaposition. We do it all the time as poets, but we don't always realize that we're doing it. So I hope that helps to clarify what enjambment is. Yeah, you're welcome. All right. So my superpower, not quite my superpower, but I'll take the credit. Thanks, Abraham. So we do have a poem here written by Vicente Huidobro, which is a poem that I always like to reference when talking about poetics, because poetics are important. They're a reason why we write the way that we write. And Vicente Huidobro wrote this poem called an Ars Poetica. This isn't the only one called Ars Poetica. An Ars Poetica is actually a type of poem that acts as a poem reflecting on poetry. And Vicente Huidobro himself was a Chilean poet who promoted the avant-garde literary movement in Chile and was the creator and greatest exponent of the literary movement called creacionismo, or creationism. He lived between the years 1893 and 1948. And this specific Ars Poetica comes from his book, The Mirror of Water, which was published in 1916, which again, that time period is a very important time period in modern contemporary poetry. It's 100 years ago, but it still has a pretty big impact on poetry today. But again, we're going to actually do some breakout sessions today to give you all an opportunity to review the work of us, the teachers. So we're not going to go too much into this particular poem and analyzing this poem, but I did want to share it with you, and I'd like to read it with your permission, because I think that it's a good poem for us to at least think about, and also a good poem to hear, because again, poetry is meant to be heard. It's meant to be performed. And whenever possible, it's always nice to hear it come to life again. So, aparte de yo leyéndolo, hay un voluntario que quizá lo quiera leer para nosotros. Do I have a volunteer that might also want to read one of them for us? Whether that be in the English or Spanish? Any takers?
I can do the Spanish.
Yeah. All right. Well, San Juanita, if you don't mind, I'll let you take the lead. You can read it for us in Spanish, and then I'll read it for us in English.
Okay. Want me to go now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Que el verso sea como una llave que abra 1000 puertas. Una hoja cae, algo pasa volando. Cuanto miren los ojos, creado sea, y el alma del oyente quede temblando. Inventa mundos nuevos y cuida tu palabra. El adjetivo, cuando no da vida, mata. Estamos en el ciclo de los nervios. El músculo cuelga como recuerdo en los museos, mas no por eso tenemos menos fuerza. El vigor verdadero reside en la cabeza. ¿Por qué cantáis la rosa, oh poetas? Hacedla florecer en el poema. Solo para nosotros viven todas las cosas bajo el sol. El poeta es un pequeño Dios.
Excellent. In the few videos that I see live there, I see some applause and some snaps. Thank you, San Juanita. Thank you for that excellent reading. All right. Y aquí, traducido para ustedes, les presento Ars Poetica by Vicente Huidobro. May the verse be as a key. May it open 1,000 doors. A leaf falls, something flies by. May all that is seen be created, and the soul of the listener be left trembling. Invent new worlds and safeguard your word. The adjective, when not a life giver, kills. We are in the cycle of nerves. The muscle hangs like a memory in the museums. In spite of this, we are not any less strong. True vigor resides in the head. Why do you sing the rose, O poets? Make it bloom in the poem. Only for us do all things live under the sun. The poet is a minor god. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. So for those who are joining in on the live stream at this time, we're actually going to end the live stream. For those on the Instagram live, you can obviously learn more about the program by going to Conchas y Café Zine's website, page on our website, dstilarts.org/Conchas y Café Zine. And for those of you joining in on Zoom right now, we're going to do some breakout room stuff. We're going to give you an opportunity to actually read some of our personal poetry and give you a chance to analyze it and give us feedback. So give us a second here really quick to get that.